All right, so now we want to talk about version control with Git and GitHub. Now, before I jump into the specifics of what these things do well, let's lay out a common scenario. So let's go ahead and jump over into just a blank Python file inside of a folder I just made up specifically for this. And let's say, for instance, you're working really hard on this and perhaps you have a Django project, but let's just call it a Python file. And in this file, I'm going to define a simple function called main, and it's going to print out os.environ. And that's it, right? And then we'll go ahead and say if name equals to main, then we will go ahead and run that main function, right? No big surprises here. Now, the thing is, if I save it and send it to somebody, well, how do I go about doing that? Now, in this case, it's really simple because I have one single file that's not really that complicated. But if we look at a Django project, even the one we've been working on has quite a few files on here. And to send over one individual file is probably not great because in a Django project, you need all of the files in order for it to function. But then also sending all the files gets a little cumbersome. Like, what do you do? Do you zip all these files together? Do you send them individually? How do you send them? Right? And then also the other big part of this is, let's say, for instance, I did send you this main.py, and instead of printing os.environ, you printed out .git and let's say ABC of some environment variable. Now, this is fine. This is probably going to be easy for me to recognize, hey, that's not what I wanted. I just wanted os.environ. Now, once you get into a lot more files, that starts to get very, very complicated. As in, well, practically impossible to manage unless you use this technology called version control. And the most popular way to do it is using a tool called Git. Version control is the concept of, well, really tracking history of changes over time. And the tracking occurs when I tell it to occur, not just arbitrarily. Like, let's say, for instance, if I hit Control Z or Command Z in here, this is sort of arbitrarily tracking. It's really just tracking every little thing that I do. Now, in many cases, that's great, especially with Control Z and, redo and all those sorts of things. But in the case of code, I don't need every little action I do in the code to be tracked. In other words, if I don't want this print statement to ever show up on it, let's go ahead and just say that I wanted to do ABC equals to 1, 2, 3 times 1, 2, 3, and then print out that one. This is now a new function. I mean, it's really simple. It doesn't really do anything, but the idea is I made some changes. I don't need my system, or I don't need anyone to know that I used to have print os.environ in here. That's like pointless altogether. So Git is going to allow us to track these changes over time. And it's a technology that can be incredibly complicated. And so what I want to do now is actually just give you a really basic introduction on how to use it, at least enough to get by with deploying your project into GitHub and actually being able to deploy it into production as well. So let's go ahead and start off by taking this Try Django Git project and turn it into an actual Git repository. So the first thing that I want to do is download version control, and that is on git-scm.com. You're going to go into the downloads portion here, and you're going to download Git for your system. Now, watching my videos, you probably have noticed that I already had Git installed with VS Code, and it's certainly possible that VS Code required a installation of Git as well, or maybe it installed it for you, or maybe some other package already installed Git for you. And in which case you can open up the terminal, whether it's in VS Code or the actual terminal itself, you can type out Git and it will give you all of these cool things here. Right? So the idea here is that we want to make sure that Git is installed before we initialize a repository, before we tell Git, hey, this is the actual folder we want to track. So inside of this folder, inside of this brand new folder, I'm going to go ahead and pwd in here. I'm going to go ahead and do git init. So this initializes that repository. All it's saying is, hey, Git, that version control system, I want you to track this entire folder, everything that's inside of here. So if I create anything, touch, or let's go ahead and just say echo ABC into the file of 123.txt. And if I do git status, I see that, hey, it's got 2 untracked files. Now, of course, there's all sorts of commands that you'll get used to over time. So just bear with me for the moment as you're kind of learning this for the first time. Maybe you already know it, but the idea here is that every file that goes in this folder, Git wants to know about it, or it will at least tell you that it knows that that file exists, but it doesn't know anything else. So let's actually make some changes here. Now, the first thing is main.py, right? So I'm going to go ahead and come back in here and say print os.environ. I'm going to go back to that, okay? So I want Git to know about this current version of main.py. Now, to do this, I can go git status. Git status will show me that I have 2 untracked files. The only file I want to track is main.py at this point. So I'll go ahead and do git add main.py. Hit enter. And now that I have that, and I run git status again, I see that it says changes to be committed, which are these. And then we've still got those untracked files. Same thing, right? So that hopefully makes sense. Now, what is this changes to be committed? Well, what we did here is we are preparing Git to essentially track these files at this time. And like, let's record the history. Now, it's actually a lot like doing make migrations. So when we did this, we said, first off, we did make migrations, and then we did migrate. So what git add does, this single command says, hey, Git, get ready to track this file and all of the changes that have just happened. Then we do git commit, and we want to actually add a message for all of the files that are currently being tracked. So this message will be added main.py. Now, the reason I'm saying added main.py is because, of course, it's a brand new file. So I'll go ahead and hit enter. And what do you know? There it is. We now have made our first commit. Congratulations. This is really exciting, hopefully. Now, if I do git status here, now it's showing me nothing, right? It's showing me those untracked files still, but it's not showing me, well, anything in pertaining to main.py. So if I actually change this from this print statement back to that, ABC equals to 123 times 123, and then print out ABC, this is like where the magic comes in, right? So if I save that, notice that VS Code turns it yellow. Of course, VS Code has all of these things going on with Git as well, which I'll get into in a moment. But for now, what we can see is inside of the terminal, if I do git status again, now it shows me that main was actually modified. It showed me that a change occurred between the last commit, the last these are the changes that were done, to now we made a bunch of changes. And what are those changes? That's what's inside of main.py. So if I do git diff main.py, this actually will show me literally the changes that have occurred between the 2 versions, really between the 2 commits. So the commit is like saying, hey, this is the final version at this time. And we can actually see all of those versions by going into git log. We can look at all of the commits you've ever made inside of this git log. Okay, cool. So that is some of the fundamentals here. Now, of course, if I added let's go ahead and do it all over again by actually adding in this 123.txt file. So again, we'll do git status. I have that file in there. Main has been changed. So first off, let's go ahead and add main. And then let's go ahead and add 123.txt. Notice that I added 2 files in here without running git commit, right? So if I do git status right now, it's going to show me that we have 2 files in here that have changed, or there are changes that have been made to my repository, and I want to make sure that my repository knows about them. So it's saying, hey, we need to commit these things. So let's go ahead and now commit them and say updated main added 123.txt. Okay, I hit enter, clear it out, and I do git log again, and I see this log of things going on. Okay, so let's say, for instance, I made a mistake, and main.py is not something I actually want to use, but instead I want to revert it back. I want it to go back to when I actually added it into this. So a quick way to do that is by doing git reset that commit ID right here. So this commit ID, the entire thing, and then -- hard. If I do that, it actually deletes this 123.txt, and it also deletes all of the changes from main.py. So what this reset did was it actually removed everything that happened between the time of now and this commit right here. So all of the files that were added, everything. So you're going to want to use this pretty sparingly, but I found it incredibly useful as a beginner, especially as I was starting to learn how to actually push it into production. Now, the nice thing is when you are on VS Code, you can actually still save these things and bring it right back in. And also in main.py, if you had the file open, I could do a Control Z, and what do you know? It's actually back to the state I had when I committed it here. But of course, if I actually look at the git log now, that old commit is gone. It's just like no longer accessible whatsoever. Okay, cool. So that is some of the basics. Now what I want to do is actually bring it over to like actually using it on GitHub and what you might likely do for future projects. So let's go ahead and open up our terminal for this one. And what I want to do is I want to navigate into my dev folder, and I'm going to make a directory called try Django, and I'll call this one GitHub. And I'll cd into try Django-GitHub. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and let's go ahead and VS Code this one open with code.open. And of course, you could always navigate to this folder as you see fit. Now, before I use VS Code, though, what I want to do is I want to actually copy the real Try Django project in here. So going into GitHub, we are going to go to cfe.sh/GitHub, hit enter. We're going to go to the repositories, and we're going to go ahead and navigate right into Try Django 3.2. Granted, you can use any of the repositories, but I'm going to use Try Django 3.2 for right now. Copy this one, and we're going to go git clone that actual entire URL, and then we want to put a period at the end just so it clones it into this folder instead of making a new folder, which would actually be the name of the repository right here. So if I hit enter, and that lists things out, notice that I have pretty much all of the same stuff from the original Try Django project, but there are things missing. So if we look at the VS Code now and actually compare it side by side, I can close out that project, but if I compare it side by side with our current Try Django project, it's missing a few key features here: bin, include, lib. So that, of course, is happening because of a file called gitignore. So this file here is actually meant to make sure that Git doesn't track certain files or folders, right? So in my case, I have bin in here as it not being tracked, okay? So let's go ahead and just do a quick git status. Notice that I have a git status. It's fine. Everything's good. This is obviously in the other project. Now, in my case, if I do a git log, I can now see all of the changes that I personally made for this code that you guys can use, right? So it's showing me all of these changes, the commits, like we could totally remove the code back to this commit. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and say git and reset that commit ID -- hard. Hit enter. Now it's going to change the code a bit. Actually, it didn't make a very noticeable change. So let's go ahead and go even further back to where maybe it's really noticeable. Perhaps one of the first commits that we have. I'm just going to go back all the way back here. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and do git reset to that commit and doing hard. And now all of my code changes quite a bit. Gitignore is still in there, which is nice. But the code has all changed a lot. So the cool thing about this is now as a learner, I can actually look at the code at this time, right? I can just look at settings, what happened in settings at this time. And I can also just come back into that git log and I can look at, maybe specific lectures or lessons that have that code as well. And of course, I encourage you to play around with all these things, but realistically, we're probably not going to go backwards in time. We want to go forwards. So what I can do is I can do something called git pull, and I just hit git pull. And if I do git log, I am actually back to the original branch, the very top, the most recent change of all of Git, right? So more than likely, if you just did the git pull in the future, like after this video or in the future video, there's a really good chance that this won't even, you'll have a lot more code here. It should actually be identical to what's on GitHub right here. Now, of course, you can always download the zip file of the code, but the thing is, downloading that zip file will not give you this log. It won't give you all of the changes that have happened to this code over time, like in this series. So that is certainly one of like the downsides of just grabbing the code itself. That downside is something that you might use from time to time. Now, the other thing is, perhaps you don't want all of my old version controls changes, but you want all of my current code. Now, to do that, we can actually remove the Git folder. So if I list everything out, I've got this Git folder here, and that's .git, right? So it looks like a Git or a actual dot file, much like our .env, but it's actually a folder itself. So if I cd into .git, I can see a lot of things that are related to this particular repository, which includes the logs and how it handles certain things. But if I go back in here, I can actually remove that. So if I do rm-rf.git, that actual Git repository is gone. If I do git log here, I got nothing. If I could git status here, I've got nothing. And that's because I just removed everything about the Git repository, which is good and bad, right? It's actually okay to do stuff like this when you're learning. Now, if I still needed to use the original repository, well, there's a couple ways to do it. First off, I could do git clone and paste that in here and hit enter. Uh-oh, it already exists. I can't actually override this empty dictionary, or an empty directory rather. We can go back and do rm-rf try-django-github. And then I can go ahead and make that directory again. So make dir try Django-github, and then cd into it again, and git clone that again. And of course, all of it's right back to where I was originally. Okay, so several commands that we want to learn. Now is a really good time to actually put this code, all of this code, into my own GitHub. And so I'm actually going to simulate this because obviously this is my own GitHub. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to log in to my account. You should do the same on github.com. And we're going to create a new repository. So in here, we'll go ahead and go new repository. And this new repository, I'm going to go ahead and say try Django 3.2 private. Okay, so I got a dash private here. And so what I want to do here is I'm going to make it a private actual repository. And then I'll go ahead and create this repository. Okay, so it gives you actually a few commands that you can use with your code. And so now that I do have this code, and again, I still have that repository or the Git right here, what I want to do is actually remove that original repository. So rm/rf or -rf, we're going to remove .git. Windows users are going to have to use a different command to remove this directory, but the idea is to just remove it. Then I'll go ahead and do git init. And so it's actually this command right here. We actually do not need this add stuff per se, but we do need this remote. Okay, so git remote add origin. And then notice that everything is green in here. If I do git status, I see that it's not tracking any of those files. Now we could totally do git add and just go off one by one. Or I can do git add --all, and that's just going to add all of the changes I've made recently. Then, of course, if I do git status again, it's showing all of these quote unquote new files that are happening. And then I'll just go ahead and do git commit -message, and we'll go ahead and say initial commit. And now if I do git status again, we're good. We're ready to actually push this onto GitHub. Okay. So the remote is the key here. So if I do git remote, I see that I have something called origin. That's because I added that. So git remote and -v. This gives me a little bit of a verbose of what origin is. So the remotes themselves are the hosts that you're going to push to GitHub at some point, or Git. Any host that actually handles your Git code can be considered a remote. Right, so it's just not local, it's remote. Local would be your local machine. Remote would be another machine that has maybe the exact same repository that you're working on. So considering that we have origin here, I can also say git remote add, let's say GitHub, and use literally the exact same link here. And then we can do git remote -v again. And now I have really two ways to name that server, right? Origin is just the most common way for your baseline remote repository. So if you were putting it on Bitbucket or GitLab or AWS or Google Cloud, you can absolutely use origin however you see fit for where this is going to be hosted. Now, hopefully you're wondering what the heck is origin for? What are these remotes for? Well, really it's to do the command of git push origin and then main. And if I hit enter here, I'm getting this repository is not found, right? So the reason that I'm getting this repository is not found actually has to do with the user I'm currently logged into, right? So I actually did this on purpose in the sense that if you try to push to my Coding for Entrepreneurs account, it wouldn't work for you. It would actually fail like this, right? And so especially a private one, which is what I need to do right now. So I'm just going to pause. Now I'm going to go ahead and use the Coding for Entrepreneurs private repo here. And I'm just going to go ahead and add this remote again and paste it in here. And of course I get this error, this remote already exists. So what I can do is I can remove these remotes. So remote, remove origin, and then git remote, remove, and GitHub. And now I can do git remote, add origin with that new one, right? Or press up a few times and do that. And now I can do git push origin main. And that will now push my code into GitHub. And there it is, right? Okay, so that's kind of initializing it. Now we're at a point where how do we actually use it? And so I realize this is probably something you'll have to review several times. And that's also why I made this post right here is as a reference for a lot of the things we just did, like a lot of these ongoing usage type things. And I'll intend to actually update this blog post as much as possible. But the idea now is how do I actually use this going forward, right? So just a quick recap on what we did so far is we made a directory, some directory with our project. And then inside of that project, we did git init. This typically happens right when you start the project. I actually did do that with our code. I just didn't do it on the video. Once you initialize it, then it's pretty much ready to go. And you're going to want to decide a host. So git remote. And that host, if it's GitHub, you're going to have to log into GitHub, create a repository, get that repository, and do git add origin or whatever you want to call that repository or that host. We're going to go ahead and git add origin and then, your actual link and all that, right? You would put whatever your data is there. And then after you do that, then it's time to start actually tracking changes to your code. So we created a folder, we initialized it, and then we add a remote. That's pretty much it. And then what we want to do is track those files. So let's say, for instance, in my settings here, right, I'm going to go ahead and just make a simple change. Let's get rid of this secret key altogether, right? So this insecure secret key, I'm going to get rid of it. GitHub does not like when you put secret keys on GitHub for Django, which is good. We don't want to put secret keys either. So now I made a change. I do git status. I do git diff. I can just write out diff and it'll give me all of the changes for all of the files. Or I can do git status and then get the difference for this, like that. And so I'm hitting Q, just so you know, I'm hitting Q to get out of that. And then we do git status again. So git add, git commit. And I'm going to go ahead and say updated settings to remove secret key. Okay. So the messages that we're making here are really intended to show you what happened with these changes. Now, if you come in here and you see git status and you have a bunch of files that have been changed over time, feel free to add each one individually and commit each one as you see fit. It's a good idea to do it pretty regularly, but I wouldn't do it as so often of like, updated settings to remove secret key. That's kind of a minor change. But if it's something I needed to do, then I would write the actual message itself. So it's kind of like one of those things that you'll get used to over time of when do you actually commit a bunch of files and when do you write a message. That's stuff that you'll definitely learn about as you go forward. But now that we've got that, I can do git push origin main, and that's going to push everything to GitHub. And if I refresh in here, notice that it actually gives me the commit message, and I can go into that file and I can see the changes that have been made, right? And what if you're like, oh no, I made a mistake. I want to actually revert back to what it was. Now you could totally do the git reset. Like I said before, you could totally reset to the previous commit, or realistically what you'll do is you'll actually just change it back and say, reverted settings to original preference or something like that. And then now again, git push origin main. Okay. So that's actually what I typically do. I know a little bit more advanced things with Git, but when I was learning and when I was a beginner to it, these were the commands. This is like pretty much all I would end up doing is git add, git commit, git push, right? Over and over and over again. Once you get those things down, then it's just a matter of configuring our hosting server. In our case, it's going to be DigitalOcean App Platform to actually grab this code and run it correctly. And of course, we have it as private right now. You don't have to have it private. You could totally have it public. And the other cool thing about this is you could have actually copied my code directly by what's called forking it. So inside of this repository, you could have went to try Django 3.2 and clicked on fork, and that would actually have copied it right inside of GitHub, in which you would have the ability to just pull it as well. But then it would be on your account, so you could actually make changes to your account and your actual code for trying Django 3.2. So another big recap. Let's just go from the top. First of all, we make that directory, so make dir. Then we do git init. Then we do git remote add origin, of course, assuming that we went into GitHub or some sort of GitHub or Git host. Then after we do that, we are going to git add either the file itself, so file name, the folder that we want to track, or everything, which -- all is one way to say everything, period is another way to say everything. After we add everything, we do git commit with a message saying this is what I changed. And then after we do that, we do git push origin main. And of course, if you used a different name for your remote, that's where you would push it to. And you're like, what's this main thing probably? This is a little bit more advanced, something I'm not going to cover right now, but it has to do with branches. So another cool thing about Git is you can actually kind of like work on the main branch. If you watch Loki, it's like that main timeline. And then if you wanted to split the branches or split the main, the main code branch, if you wanted to split them off and work on other side projects with a lot of the same code in the same repository, that's where a lot of these branches come out. And if you look at my code, I actually have those for each lesson. So I have them as branches as well as commits. So it's a lot easier to actually end up using the code itself. So that is pretty much the gist of what I wanted to cover as it relates to Git. Now, this is not intended to be comprehensive, and it was intended to be really fast so that you can watch it several times. But just remember these keys right here. The thing about making the directory and initializing your local repository, that doesn't have to happen very often. Neither does adding the origin. These three things happen pretty much one time per project. It's just something that's nice to get used to doing. These things right here are likely what you'll do over and over and over again as you start building this. And it's certainly a way to handle all of the code changes over time. And let's not forget, git status to check the status of the changes, git log to see a history of all those commits, and then, git diff to see the difference between what you already committed, what you already did here with the newest and latest changes that you're about to do. So the other part of this that's really cool is the fact that it is inside of VS Code as well. So if I actually came in here and said print, hello, and save that, what's going to happen is VS Code's going to actually recognize this. You'll actually be able to click on this and you'll be able to see the changes side by side, which I think is also really, really nice. So the original on the left, the new changes are on the right. And so VS Code itself makes it a lot easier to manage these things. And so you can actually write in the message here like hello world, ! And then hit Control Enter or Command Enter, depending on what system you're on. And that actually does the exact same thing as writing the commands in here on your own, right? So all of these commands can be circumvented with using VS Code. And then as far as pushing it, that also can be. So this right here, if you click on that, it actually will push the changes for you. And there's not a whole lot you need to do. And you can also verify that, of course, on your repo itself, which in my case, it's this one. You could verify that in here too. And notice that there's that commit of hello world. So VS Code makes Git so much easier. So a lot of the things that I just told you about Git, you could just use VS Code's built-in version control to really handle these things. And of course, you probably have already seen this time and time again. Now, one of the last key things to remember is this git ignore, to not ignore it, in the sense that if you end up putting too big of files inside of your repository, it's going to take a really long time to update your repository initially, but potentially also in the future. So I definitely recommend not pushing things that are either really, really big files or they are files that really just should not be tracked by Git. In the case of Python, that's going to be anything that's related to your virtual environment, because the virtual environment itself can be easily recreated with one command in Python and then another command using pip and requirements.txt. So yeah, there's a lot to Git. Hopefully this helps you for the next portion. The next portion, we are actually not going to be handling Git in this way. Instead, I'll actually show you how to fork it and run it from there so we can all be on the same page. But the idea is now that we can put our code into GitHub, we can actually now deploy it into production. So that is really exciting to me. Hopefully it is to you as well. Let's go ahead and take a look.